Name a city in Ohio. Most people say Columbus. Some say Cleveland. A few say Dayton, but they come from Dayton too. Yet no one, or at least not nearly enough people, mention Cincinnati, the most architecturally significant, geographically bizarre, and historically layered small city in the United States, one that got that way almost entirely by accident. But how did that happen? Well, it starts with a valley. Cincinnati has the density and skyline of a city 3 times its size because a valley forced it to be compact before anyone understood that compact was good. The bridge sitting on its riverfront was the longest suspension bridge in the world when it was built and served as the direct engineering prototype for the Brooklyn Bridge, and almost nobody knows this. 3 interstate highways carved around downtown from 3 sides and cut it off from the river that made it a city. The most stunning Art Deco railway station in the region barely runs any trains. And immediately north of downtown sits the largest intact urban historic district in the United States, preserved not by any preservation effort, but by the economic collapse that Prohibition caused when it destroyed the neighborhood's economy in 1917. That last one deserves a moment. A federal alcohol ban accidentally preserved the largest collection of Italianate architecture in the country by making the community that built it too poor to tear it down. None of this is what anyone planned, and that is exactly what makes it worth understanding. Let's start with geography. Cincinnati was founded in 1788 in a narrow basin on the north bank of the Ohio River. Steep hills rise almost immediately behind the riverfront, which meant the early settlers had a thin strip of flat, buildable land and essentially nothing else. The first streets formed a compact, walkable grid, not because anyone was thinking about pedestrian-friendly urbanism, but because the terrain left no other option. As the city boomed through the 19th century and became one of the largest cities in the United States by mid-century, that grid became denser and denser until the core was as intensely packed as any urban area in the country. Over-the-Rhine, the neighborhood immediately north of downtown, was once cited as one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in America outside of New York City. You can still feel this today. Cincinnati has a downtown that produces a genuine big city feeling in a place with approximately 309,000 residents. Several central neighborhoods have population densities of 7,000 or more people per square mile, figures more typical of major coastal cities than of a Midwestern city of this scale. The Great American Tower rises 665 feet. More than 100 high-rises are squeezed into the valley, surrounded by hills. From across the river in Covington, Kentucky, the skyline looks like it belongs to a city twice as large. The hills that constrained the city also constrained its industry. The valley and hilltop setting meant that as the city grew during the height of the Industrial Revolution, its factories had to be multi-story and on small footprints rather than sprawling horizontally the way Midwestern industrial cities typically built. The Western Corridor, the one flat stretch wide enough to support large-scale operations, became the home of the freight rail network and the massive Queens Gate Yard that remains one of the most important freight hubs in the region. Geography did not just shape how Cincinnati looks, it determined where everything went. Now for the bridge, because this is the part that should make you genuinely annoyed at how little attention Cincinnati gets. When the John A. Roebling Suspension Bridge opened to traffic on January 1st, 1867, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. Its main span measured 1,057 feet across the Ohio River, connecting Cincinnati to Covington, Kentucky. It was the first bridge to use both vertical suspenders and diagonal stays fanning from each of its 230-foot stone towers, a structural innovation that Roebling had been developing across previous projects and that he needed to prove at this scale before he could convince anyone to let him build something bigger. He then built the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge, which opened in 1883 and became one of the most celebrated pieces of infrastructure in American history, was a direct descendant of the Cincinnati Bridge. Same engineer, same structural principles, executed at greater length. The Cincinnati Bridge held the world record for span length for 16 years, from 1867 until its own successor took the title. The Brooklyn Bridge is a New York landmark. There are songs about it, movies, photographs on every tourist postcard. The bridge that John Roebling built first, that he used to prove the techniques the Brooklyn Bridge would later use, that held the world record for longer than most people live, sits in Cincinnati and is known primarily to locals as the Singing Bridge because the open Great Deck hums when cars drive across it. More than 166,000 people walked across it in its first 2 days of operation. The people of 1867 understood what they were looking at. Somewhere in the intervening century and a half, the national memory of where the Brooklyn Bridge came from got misplaced. The interstate highway era arrived in Cincinnati in the 1950s and 60s, and the valley that had forced the city to be compact turned out to also be a problem for highway planners who needed somewhere to put 3 major interstates converging on the same point. I-75, I-71, and I-74 all converge on Cincinnati, and the interchanges and corridors required to manage that convergence have a footprint that rivals downtown itself. The highway planners did what highway planners of that era did everywhere, which was to route the roads through the most convenient available land without excessive concern for what the land contained. Significant portions of older neighborhoods were cleared, the connections that had linked surrounding districts to downtown were cut or rerouted. And the riverfront, which had been Cincinnati's economic foundation for a century, was separated from downtown by a surface highway that formed a continuous barrier between the city and the Ohio River. The highway was later lowered into a trench, which reduced some of the visual impact. The separation is still there. Drive along the river in Cincinnati today, and the sense of the downtown turning its back on the water is still palpable, the product of a decision made 70 years ago that cut the city off from the river that made it exist. Cincinnati's narrow valley meant the interstates had proportionally less space to work with than in most comparable cities, which is why the highway infrastructure ends up feeling so dominant relative to downtown. There was no room to route around things. Everything ended up adjacent to everything else. And then there is the train station. Cincinnati Union Terminal was completed in 1933. Its half-dome Art Deco facade is among the most architecturally dramatic in any American city of Cincinnati's size, which is itself a remarkable sentence given that Cincinnati is not a city most people associate with architectural ambition. The terminal consolidated multiple smaller stations into a single hub and was built to handle the volume of passenger rail that Cincinnati's importance as a transit hub seemed to guarantee. Passenger rail declined rapidly after World War II. By the 1970s, most services had ended. The terminal now operates as the Cincinnati Museum Center and handles Amtrak's Cardinal Line 3 times per week in each direction. A building designed for hundreds of trains daily receives 6 train visits per week in total, which works out to approximately 1 train every 28 hours. What makes this more interesting rather than just sad is the view from directly outside the terminal. The Queensgate Yard, the massive freight facility that has operated on the adjacent flat corridor since the rail network established itself there in the 19th century, is immediately visible. Trains are moving through it constantly. The freight network that the terminal was built to complement is still fully operational. It is a very specific kind of architectural tragedy, a building built in exactly the right place, at exactly the wrong moment, that now functions as a museum for natural history and science. While the industrial corridor it was meant to anchor keeps running outside its windows. Now for the neighborhood that nobody outside Cincinnati seems to know about, which is the most significant omission in the national conversation about historic urban fabric. Over-the-Rhine was settled by German immigrants beginning in the 1830s, who named it for the Miami and Erie Canal that separated it from downtown Cincinnati, which reminded them of crossing the Rhine back home. By the late 19th century, it was a dense, commercially active neighborhood of multi-story brick buildings in the Italianate style, with 30 German-American-owned breweries operating within its borders. In 1917, Prohibition shut all 30 of them down. The economic collapse that followed was severe and sustained. With its primary industry gone, Over-the-Rhine entered decades of decline. Buildings deteriorated, people left. Without the brewery industry, there was no money to fund anything new. This is the part that matters for the preservation story. The same economic devastation that made Over-the-Rhine a struggling neighborhood also meant nobody could afford to demolish the old buildings and replace them with new ones. The Italianate brick tenements, commercial buildings, churches, and social halls that had been constructed in the 19th century simply stayed. They were not maintained, but they were not replaced either. By 2006, the National Trust for Historic Preservation declared Over-the-Rhine one of the 11 most endangered historic places in America. The threat was real. The neighborhood had lost significant portions of its building stock to demolition over the decades and was 4 demolitions away from passing 50% destruction of its historic structures. The neighborhood that survived that threat is now understood to be the largest, most intact urban historic district in the United States. Over-the-Rhine was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1983 with 943 contributing buildings across 360 acres. It contains the largest collection of Italianate architecture in the country. It is larger than Charleston's historic district and larger than the French Quarter in New Orleans. And it exists because Prohibition destroyed its economy so thoroughly that nobody could afford the normal process of urban redevelopment. The old buildings stayed because tearing them down and replacing them required money that did not exist. The neighborhood has revitalized significantly since the 2000s. Breweries, restaurants, and residential conversions have brought activity back to streets that were largely empty 20 years ago. The architecture that survived is now recognized as what it actually is, one of the most significant collections of 19th century urban fabric in the country. None of this was planned. The density was geographic necessity. The bridge was an engineering proof of concept. The highways were a regional traffic solution that happened to reshape a city. The train station was optimism in concrete. And Over-the-Rhine survived because poverty is sometimes the best preservationist. The valley forced the density. The density justified the bridge. The bridge was the prototype for the most famous bridge in the country. The highway era surrounded the density from 3 sides and cut it from the river. The greatest train station in the region was built for passengers who mostly stopped coming, and an entire neighborhood was accidentally preserved by the law that destroyed its economy. Most cities are the sum of their plans. Cincinnati is the sum of its accidents. And that's what makes Cincinnati arguably the most unique city in America.